This is Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Well, hello, my friends out there. Welcome to yet another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Trent, my friend, we got a special episode for everyone here because we have a guest with us. What do you think?
So excited, man. We have a chance to interview Laura Kipnis. She is, I'll describe her in just a second, but I've been a fan of hers for several years. I read her book, Against Love, about 2.5 years ago, and I've reread that book. I'm always referring to it. I've seen a lot of her videos and seen her appearances on podcasts and stuff, and she's a great thinker and a great writer and a wonderful person. And we had a great interview with her. And let me tell everyone about, not everyone will be familiar with her. Some people will, but let me kind of give a little bio sketch, introduce Laura Kipnis to everyone. Laura Kipnis is always thoughtful, usually funny, and incapable of writing a boring sentence. A cultural critic encapsulates the thrust of her work. She has worked as a professor, an author, and an essayist, and she has written 7 books, including Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus, Men, Notes from an Ongoing Investigation, How to Become a Scandal, Against Love, a Polemic, The Female Thing, Dirt, Sex, Envy, Vulnerability, and Bound and Gagged, Pornography and the Politics of Fantasy in America. Her most recent book is Love in the Time of Contagion, A Diagnosis. Some of the publications that have published her essays are New Republic, The Guardian, Playboy, Slate, New York Review of Books, The Nation, and New Left Review, to name a few. She has taught at Northwestern, Wisconsin, Michigan, and been a visiting professor at NYU, Columbia University, the University of British Columbia, and the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. She's currently professor emeritus at Northwestern University, and she lives in New York. And if you want to learn more, go do it on your own, bunch of lazy bums. Her website is Laura Kipnis, KIPNIS.com, LauraKipnis.com. So don't make Joel and I do all the work for you. Get out there and find out about her.
Excellent introduction. How about we jump into this interview?
I'm for it.
Here we go.
All right, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Joel and I, so excited tonight to be joined by Laura Kipnis for an interview with her. Laura Kipnis is an author, teacher, an essayist, and a cultural critic. Some of her books include Against Love, which was my first introduction to Laura, Men, Notes from an Ongoing Investigation, How to Become a Scandal, Bound and Gagged, and most recently, Love in the Time of Contagion, a nice COVID-19 reflection on relationships. Laura, Joel and I have talked about you on multiple occasions, and we wanted to have you on because you write and speak cleverly and honestly, and you're also almost always, in fact, I would just say always entertaining, and that's a hard thing to pull off. And Joel and I on our podcast, so one of the things that we try to do is we try to eschew patented answers, and we want to promote to others the importance of good conversations that may produce good answers, but don't have to. We just want to keep good and intriguing conversations going. So that's the reason we wanted to have you on tonight. So.
Absolutely. And just to kind of get us going, Laura, could you tell us and our audience, like, what are you up to these days, work-wise, and what intrigues you in your leisure time?
So one of the reasons I was actually interested in doing this podcast with you guys, which I often avoid doing these things because I don't really like hearing myself talk, or I don't ever feel like I have anything new to me to say. I feel very much at a loss these days. And so I thought like being on the spot and being asked to talk about what I'm thinking and doing would force me into coming to grips with some things. So, I mean, that's just to preface everything I say, is to say, I don't know what I'm thinking or doing. I mean, I think like a lot of people, I have been at a loss since the election. I felt really derailed. I stopped reading the newspaper. And for somebody who's, got up every morning and read the newspaper, for the last God knows how many decades, it's a very odd feeling to feel so dislocated. And, I don't know if that registers with you, but I know a lot of people I know feel that way. And since I'm somebody who has often felt like there's a political undercurrent to what I write, even if I'm not writing in a direct way about issues, I have always felt that I'm kind of intersecting with the moment and with my culture and with American politics and, international politics to some degree. So I'm floundering. So I'm hoping you guys that this will be therapeutic for me. Just to say that. And the other thing I was going to say about writing and projects, since I feel so in between things, is that I think I've always been a bit passive as a writer. Like, I often wait for people to ask me to do things or write things, and then I usually end up trying to kind of push past whatever the actual assignment is and stretch it or, deform it or distort it in whatever ways I can. And looking back on what I've written, most of what I've written has actually been or started out at someone's invitation. So like, it's not a good thing. And I think I should make my own projects. But, recently I've really just been writing a lot of book reviews because I've been asked to do that. And, that is a way of trying to figure out what you think about something. And oftentimes, like, books that I've written, and I think I've written 7 or 8 books, have started out with some kind of smaller project or invitation that someone's asked me to do, and then it develops into something because it is a way of figuring out what I'm thinking at the moment. So that's but to say that I'm like in between things. I've been writing reviews. There's an essay that I want to write, and I guess one of my New Year's resolutions is to write more essays and fewer reviews. So just because I think it's a more expressive form, even though when I write criticism, and I can talk more about this, I actually do try to treat it as an expressive form.
Yeah. Yes to more essays, please. Yeah.
Please write more. Laura, so it's very interesting. I appreciate your candor there. Would you attribute some of your feeling of lostness to a cynicism about what you're actually producing, what impact it might be having, or just sort of a general sense that there's nothing new under the sun, there's nothing new that can be happening? I mean, it's funny because I've seen you in interviews, and I can't like give a full trajectory of your career, but like I read Against Love, which came out in 2003, I think. And then I've seen you in interviews in more recent years where you don't repudiate what you wrote, but you talk about how you've grown and you've had experiences that have changed the way you think. I mean, would you attribute some of it to cynicism, or do you know where it's coming from?
So I was very influenced by the Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson, and who just died a couple of months ago. And a lot of Against Love and what I've written generally has kind of been under the sway of his ideas about utopianism. And so I think like Against Love, and the way that I treated adultery, since it's a book that has a lot to do with people kind of trying to break out of the confines of particularly domestic institutions and find other forms of freedom and expressivity and experimentation. And I was arguing that in this kind of like everyday way, or this vernacular way, people do that through in personal life by, contesting the forms that they've been handed, like the concept of marriage. But it was an idea very influenced by Fred's work. And I call him Fred because I knew him. There's a particular essay he wrote called Reification and Utopia in Mass Culture. And so like what he was doing was taking the most sort of, I don't know, like conventional everyday forms, like a movie like The Godfather, and finding like the utopian dimension in it.
Mm.
And so I think a lot of what I was writing over the years was influenced by this idea of his. And so I was always kind of looking to find where are the forms of rebellion, where are the forms of anti-institutionality, and where are people, being expressive and trying to find freedom. And, even like in a form like, or, convention like adultery, I was arguing that, people are, that there are these yearnings for freedom. And so I was always trying to look and see where are those moments. And I guess you use the word cynicism. I guess maybe my cynicism at the moment is that I think all possibilities for pushback, except in the most kind of reduced ways, seem to have been defeated. So the kind of larger sense of political defeat for people who are progressives or on the left, I think has got me as a writer feeling like, it's sort of, as you say, what does it matter? What does what I say matter? So, if you're writing a book review and you're just trying to engage with someone else's writing and think of interesting things to say, it's less pressing. But, like essays are a more personal form, and you are trying to find, spaces to figure out something that maybe hasn't been said. But I'm struggling. I think, maybe it's kind of depression, oppressive realism, so I feel like as a writer, I am struggling a bit at the moment. And I was interested, you sent me a list of questions, and, nobody has ever asked me to talk about religion before. So I was also intrigued by that and did some thinking. And I was so, that's very offbeat, to come to me, it was like the most secular probably person, around to ask about religion. Anyway, but I thought I liked that, that took me by surprise.
I love that. And Trent, I'm going to jump on one of your questions here because I think it kind of ties what you're talking about, Laura. So you call yourself this cultural critic. And, I used to be a pastor for 20 years. We both have multiple degrees in theology. And we've been on our own evolutions over time as well. I always just use the kind of the kitschy phrase, transcend and include. So new doors open, but I tried to keep all the rooms I used to live in, all those doors open as well. And the word that comes to me when I think about what you do as a cultural critic is in the Hebrew Bible, the word is navi, and it just means seer. It often gets translated as prophet. Of course, we have a lot of connotations in modern thinking what that word means, but ultimately, what the prophet was, it could have been the classic, jester in the court who is using humor to poke fun at power, or it could be the social justice warrior calling out the ills in society. But ultimately, if you boil it down, it just means seer. It's just someone who sees and then speaks about what they see. So with that in mind, I'm wondering if maybe there are some more overlaps, albeit maybe unknowingly, with religious traditions in your ability to see and be a cultural critic.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about this was that I should say that I'm Jewish, but was raised completely without any religion. We identified as Jewish, but my sister and I never even went to Sunday school, which a lot of our friends did. So we had no religious upbringing or education at all because our parents were both completely secular, and so were our grandparents. I mean, beyond secular, I think just kind of not particularly interested in religion. It was never seen as a particularly relevant to anything. I think my people are just very pragmatic people as opposed to spiritual people. But I was talking to my sister last weekend, and one of the things I realized is that, like, as I say, we're both very secular and a-religious, but we're both completely also superstitious. Like, both feel very much like that we're visited by our dead father, my father, who we were both very close to, died a couple of years ago. And we both feel that he's, comes and visits us and says things and gives advice and, butts in and all the stuff that he used to do. So I became interested in this idea of the superstition, like the culture of my sister and the family that we created within our family is this superstitious culture, but that one that is kind of open to, I'm not sure I would exactly say a spiritual dimension, but my father himself was very interested in such things as coincidence. He didn't believe that there were coincidences. I mean, he really, I think at some level, he'd just kind of shake his head and say, we don't understand. But I think at some level, there was this idea that there are forces, in the universe that we don't really understand and that are, not particularly rational or graspable in rational terms, but yet you have to sort of pay attention to them. And one of the things my dad used to say to me, this is to kind of circle back to what you were asking. He had this idea, which was very flattering to me, and he was always quite flattering to me as a writer, that I sensed things that were going on in the culture before they exactly happened. And so I think that I wouldn't call myself a seer or a seer, except that I think I feel the perturbations of cultural contradictions, like when there are things going on that either people are lying about or, prevaricating, if you want to say that, or that, things don't add up. Like, so adultery was one of those topics where people pledge to one thing and act in a completely other way. And it's the elephant in the room. So I was always kind of very interested in the elephants in the room, the things that people don't talk about or want to talk about or that are disruptive, yet everybody knows that's what's going on. So, for example, one of the reason my father would say that to me, that I was kind of a step ahead of the culture, was that one of the first things I wrote as a critic that got attention was an essay about Larry Flint and Hustler magazine. Called Desire and Disgust in Hustler. And I went and read through like all these back issues, 10 years, whatever I could find of Hustler magazine. And I actually ended up meeting Larry and
oh, wow.
In a little bit. But I guess that was after the first version of the essay came out. But after I wrote, and I didn't lead the trend, but after I wrote on Larry Flint and was published in this academic book, but it got a lot of play. So, like, even Larry's ghostwriter got in touch with me and said, Larry, would like to meet you. But right after that, or shortly after that, like the Milos Forman movie came out, and Larry Flint started to become more of this cultural anti-hero. And, I think it was, I guess, I was trying to think about transgressive figures in the culture, at that moment, like who was, say, like crossing the high-low divide, or I don't know. I was asking these academic questions in my mind about cultural figures, and Larry Flint was the answer to the questions I was asking. So, as I say, like then a lot of other people started writing about Larry Flint. But anyway, one of the things I said in one of the books I wrote, it might have been Love in the Time of Contagion, is that I just write out of a sense of irritation. So like when I feel irritated by a question, like I can't answer it, or I think, as they say, people are bullshitting about it, that irritation is a kind of muse to me. So that's, if I really kind of see your, it's just out of irritation.
Well, I want to get a little bit granular to follow up with what you're talking about, because like one of the things that I've noticed both in your writing and your interviews is that you don't seem to be satisfied, like even with your own when you're making like great points and a sentence has been really well written, you don't seem satisfied even when your audience, the people who might be your fans or people who are supportive. I've seen in interviews where people get really excited about something you've just said and you seem shy about that, or almost as if like there's more work to be done. Like you seem to be a little bit bothered by consensus, and maybe the ways that it can, repel further conversation and investigation. Before you answer that, though, I wanted to, because some people who are watching this won't have read maybe any of your books. Can I share like a quotation that's from Against Love that's kind of germane to what you've said and what we're talking about?
Yes. Yes,
so this is from Against Love, and you write, questioning social institutions was a permissible activity. This is kind of in reference to, you were talking about a time in American history in the like 1850s or 1800s when there was a more experimental attitude as a young nation. And you write, questioning social institutions was a permissible activity, even if no reassuring answers were forthcoming. Why not at least entertain the possibility that there could be forms of daily life based on something other than isolated households and sexually exclusive couples? Why not confront rather than ignore the reality of disappointment and the deadening routinization that pervades married households? Maybe confronting the flaws in married life would be a route to reforming a flawed society. Maybe reforming the fabric of individual relationships was the path toward political renewal. And I love that little excerpt, and I like the first line, like questioning social institutions was a permissible activity. And I think, Laura, the thing that, and you can follow up to this, the thing I think is that Joel and I go in for is, even if we have a discussion about a political issue or a social issue, and we don't arrive at sort of like a new solution to a problem, or to a new solution, like, we think that having the conversation is important. And what going back maybe to what you were talking about with some of your exasperation with maybe all of the political energies or feel like they've been exhausted, is I've had conversations with people, and I've shared my frustration with Joel on podcasts, but I've had conversations with people, let's say, about economic models and capitalism and socialism and these kinds of things. I feel like sometimes you can't even have the conversation. Not, God forbid that we're actually talking about, oh, we have the answer. But sometimes if you even begin to propose an alternative model, just as an experiment in the imagination, I feel like it's not even allowed in the culture right now. So it feels like it's kind of sterile and just banal. And that seems to be the kind of thing that doesn't energize you. I mean, you seem to be energized by possibilities and these kinds of things, even if it doesn't flesh out to something immediately. But keeping those possibilities in circulation seems to be exciting to you. Is that seem to be correct?
I mean, I think that was true. I think the passage you were reading from Against Love, and it's been a while since I've read through that whole book, I'm pretty sure I was talking about the utopian communities that were formed in, the U.S., I think mostly in the Northeast, kind of maybe connected with transcendentalism, and that sense of experimentation that maybe was partly, the country was newer, but I think, and people were willing to experiment. And I think some of them were these kind of religious or intentional sort of communities, but I'm not an expert on them at all. And I've forgotten everything that I once knew. So yeah, that was always very interesting to me. And the American tradition of experimentality was very interesting. And I'm not sure where that energy has gone, but to take it back just to myself and kind of discourse, I guess, for a moment. I was joking at the beginning that I don't often like doing podcasts because one of the reasons is I don't like sounding like a pundit. I'm in a position where I'm supposed to produce things I've already thought and said. I'm very bad at it. And I think you mentioned in the questions that something I did at the New York Public Library with Esther Perel was just kind of we were talking, I think it was a panel about love. And of course,
Yeah.
she is somebody who gives advice. She's a psychologist. And so she had all her talking points, and, they were rehearsed, and they were, uh, she performed them very well. And I felt so like not engaged by that kind of conversation where you're just repeating points you've made before.
Hmm.
I mean, it's just difficult for me to do that because I bore myself. I feel like, I'm just, I don't know, performing in this empty way. So it makes me a very bad pundit, is what I'm saying. Like, it's hard for me to sound authoritative in the way that you need to do often in those kinds of settings.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. I was just thinking as you're kind of talking, Trent, about that quote, and Laura, you were talking about the utopian kind of teachings and activities that so many people in this country were up to, and outside of this country too. I think it's something that happens all throughout human history. And the word I often apply to kind of where I feel like we're at in our country today is the word ego. And I mean that, bigger than Jungian psychology, which he's the one who really helped crystallize my thinking around what I mean there. But I find that showing up in so, not only as, trained theologian in Christianity, but also I find in other religions. Basically, what I'm finding is that this false self, Thomas Merton, one of my favorite mystics in America, talks about that false self. He uses that as a kind of a synonym. And I think that what we tend to be up against right now are people that are very like rigidly like attached to their egoic expressions, which is the root of all our fear or the root of all our insecurity. And it often can come out very aggressively, or it can come out just very like isolationist kind of ways. The ego finds all kinds of ways just to be right about itself. And so I'm curious, as a cultural critic, and you speak and write with a little bit of snark, right? And you like to poke the tiger occasionally. What do you think is really needed to help that this egoic space because I think it's not just individual, and now we're looking at more like a societal ego that's showing up and is coalescing thanks to media. What is a way that you think could be a way to shift some of those gears, or at least to plant new seeds?
Well, I guess as a writer, I mean, I am interested in individualism, and I am interested in the individual because I'm very interested in like the voice, and I think one of the things that I worked on as a writer and that I'm most interested in other writers is this voice, the quality of the individual voice that comes out of an individual imagination, and that's not homogenized and not subject to group approval, but it really is based in, I mean, you used the word ego. I mean, maybe I would think maybe more emanates from something a bit more unconscious than the ego. So, like the imagination. And so culture, and our cultural inheritance, including literature and writing, I think are very much a product of those kinds of individual explorations. So, I mean, that would be like the positive side of ego, that it's, I think, the origin of, of modern culture. I mean, culture in the sense of the arts, let's say, literature, painting, music, takes a kind of, I don't know, it's a way of transposing an individual consciousness into some kind of form, or using form as a container for imagination and for imaginative kinds of acts and interactions. Because I think a lot of culture is about the ways that we, like you as a writer, interact with the writing that's come before you and, are influenced by it. Or, Harold Bloom's famous phrase, the anxiety of influence, you're influenced and thus you reject it and you create something new. So, so that's the upside of like the individual or the ego, I guess I would say. So I'm not entirely against it. I mean, I think there's probably a different thing than that you mean that's more, kind of a product of I don't know, capitalist consumerism and the ways that we're all kind of atomized or, you know, um, and isolated from each other and console ourselves with, consumer goods and, which I myself have been doing a lot of online shopping lately. So anyway, so I think like there's different ways you could talk about this idea of the individual or the ego or the
Yep.
imagination, because I suppose if I have any consolation at this moment, it is in some kind of continuity of cultural inheritance that's where you can kind of connect with imaginations that have come before you, and feel, I don't know, humanized by them or the record of them.
Laura, going back to the identification as of yourself as like a cultural critic, why do you think that that role is important for society, and how did you come to think of yourself that way? Probably people were telling you that before. I mean, maybe in different ways they were saying, you tend to see things in ways that other people can't see. You tend to absorb sort of the culture. You see the forest and the trees, but they were telling you this, I'm sure. But how did you come to see yourself in this way, and why? What if you think it's important? Why is it important?
I think I would have to say something about my trajectory of formation, because it's kind of unconventional in a way. I came out of the arts. I went to art school and started as a painter and ended up doing like video art. And when I was teaching filmmaking, but I was interested in academic kinds of ideas and theories and culture, but I don't have a PhD. I have an MFA, a Master's of Fine Arts. So one of the things that meant was that, I mean, for people who came out of like traditional academic, or acculturated in academia, like my partner is an historian who has a PhD, which, I don't have. Those people, I mean, he didn't, but a lot of those people just get the life beat out of them, coming up through academia and being like, there's this word, you're in a discipline, but you're also disciplined by the requirements of making your way through a PhD program and producing a dissertation and all of that. So, a lot of what happens is that you learn, particularly people who want to go into academia, like not to be interesting,
Interesting.
to not challenge the people who came before you. You're not, just to pay obeisance to, people in your field, let's say. So I didn't have that upbringing because I didn't really have a discipline coming out of the art. So I could kind of do what I wanted. So I was very lucky to arrive in academia at a time when you could get a decent job and do the work you wanted to do and, make a living in a way, sort of a living. I mean, enough of a living, but then one that didn't subject you to market forces. I have made a living as a writer because I never wanted to write for money, that I would have to live on, because then you end up writing a lot of stuff that you don't really want to write. So there are a lot of things that happened to me in my, professional life that were kind of lucky and, lucky accidents in a way. So I did have a kind of freedom that I think a lot of people don't have, as a writer or an artist. And, even in the kind of teaching I was doing, it wasn't in a super hierarchical kind of environment. I could more or less do what I wanted. So if I look back, I think I had a rare amount of liberty and mobility compared to the situations a lot of people find themselves in.
I like that, and I look forward to talking with you later to hear what message your father would give you about what lucky accidents really are.
Well, Laura, we were kind of winding it down a little bit here, but I want to say, not to put you on the spot or say you need to work for us, but like I hope that the sense of lostness may result in produce some very interesting things, because you're one of the, I don't know, 10 writers that I know where I keep coming back to your stuff. It's been very meaningful for me. Very briefly about myself, but our audience knows this about us, but I left the church after finishing my master's degree in theology. I was an extremely devout Christian, and then I left the church a little over 10, I guess about 10 years ago. And one of the important things for me was sort of finding voices that kept me interested and kept me thinking and kept that journey going. I remember the book of Job in the Old Testament was sort of one of those places where I went to sort of pick up some irony and sarcasm. And so all of that to say, not to say you are a prophet, Laura, but like you do have sort of that prophetic imagination and that endowment. And I hope that you continue to work in ways that are satisfying to you, but knowing that there are at least two people, if there's not a million, there's at least two people who find your work very, very, very inspiring and very intriguing. And so I wanted to kind of put that out there. So
you're embarrassing me, and you're making me tear up a little. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, if I could add to that too, just the lostness that you are talking about, I resonate with as well. My wife and I have talked about these things as well. Part of the way that I've kind of helped myself, the story I'm telling myself to kind of calm myself down, is that there's the world and all kinds of cultures that have gone through things that we're going through right now. And there are swings in directions that are not attractive for people living in societies that happen. And I find myself in one of those situations, which is new to me. I was born in 1978, so I have not experienced a lot of like super deep, elongated turmoil kind of things that I feel like is the closest thing that came for me is like 9/11 maybe, or COVID. But like COVID felt like it just turned into all of this mess. I feel like we're still kind of like living in some of that, the ripples of that. And I resonate with what you're talking about, but it's your voices, is the voices like yours that I find are like bring water to thirsty people. And so I really do want to just acknowledge that the work you've done and hopefully continue to do is a light in dark places.
You've both been very generous. As I say, I'm like embarrassed. Thank you.
Great, Laura. Well, I think that we'll probably bring it to a close, except I wanted to ask, are there any, could you give us any teasers for any sort of irons that are in the fire, or anything that's being worked on? You mentioned that you've done a lot of book reviews. Is there anything current that we can look forward to, or do you need to keep us in suspense?
I just had something out in the New Republic about a book about Joan Didion, and I have another kind of review essay in the New Republic about a book on Socrates that just came out by a woman philosopher. But I'm also I've become very interested in the subject of expats. I was just abroad for about 7 weeks in a place with a lot of expats. And, I think everybody wanting to kind of flee this moment made me interested in expat culture. So I do want to try to write something about that. So that's the essay that is on the burner.
Fascinating.
Wow. And I hope I'm not saying too much here, but I know people can find you at find more about you at laurakipnis.com.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of the essays that I've written. I've got PDFs up and that kind of thing. So yeah.
Great,
awesome.
Great. And everybody go out and get as many of her books as you can. If you hate being entertained and you hate thinking deeply, steer clear, but otherwise you'll enjoy those. So yeah.
And enjoy that online shopping.
First the shopping, then the returning.
Yeah.
The shopping and the returning. Well, thank you so much, Laura, for joining us tonight. We really, really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
I appreciate it too. Thanks so much. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Have a great night. Thanks.
You too.
Wow. Here we are. We just had this amazing interview with Laura Kipnis, essayist, author, teacher, artist. Trent, how you feeling over there, dude?
Man, I'm geeking out, dude. This was kind of a dream come true for me to be able to have us talk to a great author and a great person, somebody whose work I've really, really enjoyed. And so I feel really grateful that she showed up for the interview, not just showed up physically, like she really contributed and really brought her 100%. I felt like. So I was really happy that she really allowed us to ask substantive, meaty questions and gave us really thoughtful answers. So I'm really appreciative. I had such a great time. I know you did too. And yeah, that's the way I feel about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had such a good time talking with Laura, and people like Laura who are, especially this world of essays. That is not a world that I live in nearly as much as like you, who have a background, a degree in literature, and you've shared with me many essays, and just like their vocabulary by themselves is just already an amazing experience, just to hear how people paint with words, and then to understand that her background was in art, and film and painting. It's just that makes a lot of sense to me. One thing that I thought was so interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Well, just okay. Keep that thought, but I'll say something briefly. You just made me think about my favorite, one of my favorite film directors, David Lynch, in my favorite movie of all time that Mulholland Drive. David Lynch, I think, started out as a painter and continues as a painter. He always has, and I think someone came to him and convinced him that a movie is just a series of pictures. And so, yeah, it would be interesting to if we had a chance to talk to her again, talk more about what does it mean to go from the world of painting and maybe sculpture and however else she participated in the art world, to go from that to writing. Imagine there would be an appreciation for how words and sentences and paragraphs are become pictures in people's minds, in a sense. Maybe that's not even the way she thinks about it, but it would be interesting to know how that continuity and discontinuity was at play.
Yeah. And to that point, she talked a lot about individual expression, and so you see that a lot in her. And I brought up the idea of a navi, a seer, a prophet. And while it didn't sound like she wanted to wear that mantle, I think that there is a deep connection with what she was talking about in terms of calling out the inconsistencies that she experiences and feels in culture. She said the elephants in the room. And to me, my understanding of the biblical prophet, even coming from the Jewish tradition, if you were just very specific to the Jewish prophet, that is exactly what they're doing. But they're not just up there offering polemics. Obviously, as a cultural critic, she does do that. But she does it with style. That a prophet does it with an aesthetic, an eye towards the aesthetics, with an eye towards how is this moving people? How is this interesting to people? How is this maybe inspiring or infuriating people? And so I find her work to fit that mold. What do you think, the distinction was with the question I asked and her response? How would you interpret that?
Can you say that again? You said the distinction.
So it seemed like she was talking about it, but she was like, I'm not in that lane. It's more like this. But to me, I felt like she was still talking about my lane. But I think that we might just see it differently,
Yeah, I don't know. She's kind of like an unwitting prophet, because she described herself as essentially like a secular Jew, having had a Jewish background, but not having participated, like in synagogue or church or the
Sunday school.
Formal. Exactly. And so, but I mean, what I have read of hers indicates that she is very aware of sort of how religion is operating culturally, because she talks about Protestantism and Catholicism. I mean, she makes references to religious figures and religious movements and these kinds of things. So I think she's aware of it, but maybe I don't know how much. We didn't really get into how much she has read from the Old and New Testaments. But I think that, yes, I want to follow along with what you're saying, because I was really fascinated by this when we got into it, and see her role sort of in as a cultural critic. 3,000 years ago was a prophet. It was somebody
Yep.
who sees, and you talked about that. I thought that was fascinating. Somebody who sees, and not just with their eyes, but with their spirit, with their
Mm-hmm.
mind,
Mm-hmm.
with their intuition. She sees things. Something that I admire is that something that I don't have the ability to do is to sort of see the trees and then see the entire forest, and
Mm-hmm.
bring it all together in a
Yeah.
way that allows you to make a coherent commentary on what's happening in the wider culture. I don't have that ability, but some people like her. It's almost like they feel. She used the
Mm-hmm.
word perturbations. You feel what's happening in the culture, and I think that's sort of what prophets do. But like, I love the book of Job in the Old Testament, which I don't think of as prophetic. It's not really, it's wisdom literature,
Yeah.
but the voices in that, I think whoever wrote that had an appreciation for what different genres can do, and how to call out inconsistencies, and to show the limitations of ways of thinking. And I think that's what she does. I think she doesn't let um, things in culture that are inconsistent, she calls them out, and
Mm-hmm.
she identifies contradictions. She says, she talks about the taboo,
Yeah.
which is what you're not supposed to talk about. Taboo is
I
what we
love
don't
it.
talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about those things and brings them to the surface, and invites us into a fruitful and uncomfortable discussion about these things in her works. And I hope more people can get into these things.
Yeah.
So
I find that her work, even if I don't necessarily come to the same conclusions as she might be talking about, sometimes I don't even know. She writes in a way to where I'm not even always sure what she personally believes, or if she has strong beliefs, but she just knows how to like stir the pot, and
yeah.
if people don't necessarily agree with maybe the conclusions, her work does fantastic kind of mind opening for the reader in terms of consider it from this perspective, or why is this something that we all agree is true. And I find that those are the kinds of people I want to surround myself with. I was just going to touch on the comment I made about ego, and how she kind of talked about how she saw that as like there's a positive side to ego, and she was talking about mostly individual expression, and she was talking about how that can show up through imagination. And first of all, I want to say everything that she said I also agree with, and I can understand how sometimes that might be ego that's driving it. Some of the biggest egomaniacs in the history of the world also were very interesting individuals who express themselves very powerfully. However, the distinction I would like to make, and I would love to continue talking about this with her, is there's a way that I believe that ego limits our imagination, because ego is really about the self, and it's about I've heard it said that the primary motive of the ego is to be right about itself. The problem is, I also believe that we are expansive beings, and that the containers that were developed in our early lives, which Jungian psychology would call that the ego, it's not bad or wrong. It just is, and it limits us. And it carries a lot of these parts of insecurities and fears, which drive a lot of our behaviors. And so I would argue that that same self-expression that she values and appreciates can only get bigger and more powerful when we limit the influence of our egos, because it's a smaller container when we are expansive beings. So what does it look like if we remove the boundaries of the ego and keep that same energy of self-expression? That's one thing that I think is very interesting for me personally.
Yeah. I know you have a lot of. I need to think more about these things. You have a really good fascination with the ego, and these are concepts that I'm sort of coming later to than you. So this is an opportunity for further discussion, I think, for us. But yeah, I am really hoping that she will continue to influence people in such a way, and that maybe even in a small way that our podcast can get her, expose her to a larger audience.
Yeah.
I think the unique contribution that she has to make, and that maybe jibes with ours, is how can we have conversations that don't immediately foreclose on the possibility of something new happen, even if it's not going to happen. We're here to generate ideas and to refine our thinking and to go in certain directions and then maybe come away from those directions or whatever. But as I was saying in the podcast, like, I think what can be annoying for all of us, for probably I speak for maybe for the three of us, is when we start to have a conversation, it just gets shut down immediately.
Yeah.
Like when I'll talk to people, oh, well, what if we figured out that there might be certain parts of our economy that may not be best served by a capitalist model.
Sure.
Oh, we couldn't do that. Capitalism is the only thing that's ever been shown to work. I mean, just look at Russia, just look at China. Immediately gets shut down. Like there's no imaginative space here, and
or self-reflection about what they just said.
Exactly. And that section in her book that I quoted during the interview about a more experimental time in our nation's history and utopianism and utopian ways of thinking, that's part of our cultural DNA.
Yeah, it is.
We in many ways have been an experimental, a project, a democratic project that's still ongoing. So this sort of hyper-conservative reluctance to imagine new things, I would just tell people it is a sort of a rejection of our birthright. This is who we are as Americans, as people who think about new ways of. Doesn't mean we have to do all of them. We don't have to do any of them.
Yeah.
But I think that there's something salutary about even thinking these ways and allowing ourselves to continue to expand. And then we rein it in. We do the sort of checks and balances on our own ideas. But some people just don't even want to go there. We've solved it. We've figured it out. This is the way it should be. Ironically, these usually are the people who are in the highest positions of power with the biggest bank accounts who are more resistant.
Yeah, and I think that's not only true of the conservatives. I think one of the reasons so many conservatives are so hard to talk to is because they assume that if you are not on board with their policies, that you're part of the opposite side of the aisle, which is basically the same kind of energy in my ideas. It's like they have just as much to lose. They're also wealthy, and you have people in power over there trying to protect their kingdoms and their policies. And why can't we just begin to imagine together? Why can't we begin to just go like, hey, none of this is working great. Your ideas aren't working great. My ideas aren't working great. Let's have some humility about like how we're all kind of contributing to this mess.
I might, and I might redefine, like I said, hyper-conservative. I don't even want to use that in sort of a political sense. Yeah. To me, a hyper-conservatism is, now I can get into it, is the ego.
Yeah.
Is that desire, whether you are a leftist or a right-winger, it's that desire to protect your own intellectual sovereignty from any invading force, any invading forces, which might be new ideas. And you could be a hardcore guerrilla Marxist, or you could be a big-time right-wing nationalist, whatever. But that reluctance to me is a conservative, is a hyper-conservative tendency.
The ego doesn't care about the ego doesn't care about the ideology. It just cares about making sure that everyone also believes the one you happen to hold at that moment.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right.
I mean, some of the biggest egomaniacs who are like drug addicts who get saved and become Christians become the biggest asshole religious people. And to me, it's just like, okay, you have a different belief system now, and you supposedly now believe in love but you're still a jerk. And so that's where I feel like the ego is very slippery and insidious. How did you feel like at the end when you were talking there, Trent, and what you were saying was moving for her? I found that beautiful.
Well, I did too, man. I really was moved by that, and I wasn't expecting that. Part of my insecurity is that I deal with is I always assume that like people wouldn't want to be intrigued by interacting with me, or anything like that maybe Laura would just come on because she was obliging us. But it was just so moving to see that she appreciated the conversation and appreciated that we gave her a compliment, that we identified what she does that has been meaningful to us. And you assume that people are constantly being told these things, but that may not be true. And
she has people suing her instead.
Yeah, I mean, she has gone through a lot of nonsense because of her boldness and because of her willingness to speak her mind. I mean, we could go into the whole thing during the Me Too movement about how she spoke out against the excesses and the curtailing of free speech, especially on college campuses. And so she's gone through a lot with that. But you always just assume, oh, she's always being told, how great she is and all these kind of things. But I don't know. It was an opportunity for me to tell her specifically what you do has had this impact, and it was great to be able to share that with her. So that was fun. That was really moving to see that she was able to experience our appreciation for what she does. And so, and it's a little bit selfishly motivated because I want to continue to benefit from the stuff that she writes and the stuff she talks about. So
agreed. I feel similarly. And so we'll just wrap this up here, guys. We want to thank Laura for saying yes, for coming on, for showing up vulnerably. She started out the gate just saying that she's feeling lost. And that's, to me, I'm a sucker for just kind of authenticity. Here's where I am, and unapologetically just saying it. I'm a human. And when people are like that, when they show up that way, I am very interested in anything they have to say about being human. And so thank you, Laura. Trent, do you have anything you want to offer?
Yeah, and again, you just made me realize that we just don't get that. We don't get that from public figures very often. I regard her as a public figure because of her writing and her public appearances. To get somebody to display that kind of humility and authenticity is rare. And God damn it, we need much more of that in our ridiculous faux, saccharine society. So. Thank you so much, Laura, and maybe we get a chance to do this again. So
that'd be a dream. Folks, thanks so much for joining us again for another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. See you next time.
Peace.